When the war ended in fire, why did America choose to keep its enemies' darkest minds alive? Single quote.
Shadow Archive.
The war in Europe was ending, but the hunt had only just begun. Spring, 1945. The ruins of the Third Reich smoldered under gray skies. Cities lay flattened by Allied bombs. Steel twisted like bones. Smoke clung to every breath. Hitler was dead, his dream dissolved into dust. But amid the rubble, the most valuable spoils weren't gold or territory, they were minds. American intelligence officers, part of a secret initiative known only to a few, began their sweep through the remnants of Nazi Germany. Their mission? To find and extract top German scientists before the Soviets could. The name of the mission would not be revealed to the public for decades. Operation Paperclip. It wasn't just about rockets or jets. The United States wanted the full spectrum of Nazi scientific achievement: aerospace, chemical weapons, medicine, mind control, advanced computation. It didn't matter how these men had served the Reich, what mattered now was how they could serve America. In the Bavarian Alps, beneath the wreckage of a bombed-out fortress, Allied soldiers unearthed a trove of documents, blueprints, experiments, names. Among them, Wernher von Braun, architect of the V-2 rocket, the first man-made object to reach the edge of space. The V-2 had rained terror on London, killing thousands. But to the Americans, von Braun's mind was priceless. He was found near Oberammergau, posing as a low-ranking officer. When questioned, he offered a simple truth. I wanted to reach the stars. The politics were necessary. He and hundreds of others were quietly extracted, their Nazi past sanitized by American military intelligence. They were given new identities, new homes, and a new mission: help America win the next war, one not yet fought with bullets, but with atoms, satellites, and ideology. At Fort Bliss, Texas, a group of German scientists arrived under armed escort. The desert stretched endlessly around them, hot and hostile. Locals had no idea who these men were, just that they spoke in clipped, foreign tones and worked behind guarded fences. Many wore their old Wehrmacht boots under civilian clothes. The American public knew nothing. Von Braun and his team were building rockets, bigger, faster, higher. But the truth was buried under layers of classification. These were the same minds that had worked at Peenemünde, the Nazi rocket facility where slave labor from concentration camps had fueled the V-2 program. Thousands had died to build those machines. Now those same machines were the foundation of America's space ambitions. Meanwhile, in Europe, Soviet forces were closing in on their own prizes. Smersh units scoured the eastern zones of Germany, capturing scientists and shipping them back to Moscow. Stalin wanted what Truman wanted. The Cold War was still years away in name, but in practice, it had already begun. By the time the Iron Curtain fell across Europe, the United States had quietly brought over more than 1,600 German scientists. Many had been party members. Some had overseen human experiments. Files were forged, affiliations deleted, truths erased. The price of supremacy was secrecy. And the question lingered in back rooms of the Pentagon. What had these men brought with them that hadn't yet been discovered? White Sands, New Mexico, 1946. The sun baked the desert floor until the earth cracked. A convoy rolled across the empty expanse: trucks, armed jeeps, and a bus with its windows blacked out. Inside, a dozen German scientists watched the passing terrain in silence. This was no longer Fort Bliss. This was something more. They had arrived at White Sands Proving Ground, the site chosen for America's new rocket testing program. To the outside world, it was a barren wasteland. But here, among endless dunes and silence, the future of warfare and space was being born. At the center of it all stood Wernher von Braun, now clean-shaven, in a crisp American uniform, with a badge that read "Consultant." Behind him stood men like Arthur Rudolph, the man who had managed Mittelwerk, the underground facility where concentration camp prisoners were worked to death assembling V-2 rockets. Now, he stood beneath the stars of the American flag. The first test came in July. A modified V-2 rocket, painted white with black checkered panels, stood erect against the wind. American technicians swarmed the launch pad. German engineers gave quiet instructions, their voices low and urgent. When ignition came, it was like a second sun. The rocket screamed into the sky, leaving a trail of fire and thunder. Cameras tracked it. Generals watched with narrowed eyes. It was a success. The data they gathered would lay the groundwork for Project Mercury and eventually NASA itself. But behind the numbers and trajectories lay something darker. In a locked room on the base, Army intelligence officers pored over files, translated documents from Nazi archives, pages scrawled with grotesque formulas and test results. Chemical weapon dispersal patterns, high-altitude pressure chamber results, many involving human subjects. Some of these results, it was whispered, had no scientific explanation. Files mentioned strange effects during high-G simulations. Subjects who experienced visions, auditory hallucinations, sudden, inexplicable cardiac arrest at precise altitudes. American doctors dismissed them as propaganda, or worse, as products of deranged science. But a few were intrigued. A secret memo circulated among a handful of officials, potential crossover with psychological operations. Recommend further research under controlled conditions. The seeds of MK Ultra had just been planted. As the German scientists settled into their new lives, some in El Paso, others in secret compounds, rumors spread. Locals claimed to see strange lights over the desert. Some swore they saw figures in black uniforms walking the base at night. One rancher reported finding metallic debris weeks before the famous Roswell incident in 1947. Coincidence? Or something more? The government said nothing. And the men of Operation Paperclip said less. In Washington, debate raged behind closed doors. Some officials wanted trials, accountability, exposure. Others insisted it was too late. The Cold War was accelerating. The Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb. America couldn't afford morality now. The order was given: bury the past. Build the future. Von Braun was moved to Huntsville, Alabama. He became the face of American innovation, eventually leading the Saturn V project that would take men to the moon. He appeared in magazines, gave lectures, smiled for the cameras. But behind his eyes, some said, there was always distance. As if he was still watching something no one else could see. Back in Germany, the survivors of Peenemünde and Mittelwerk watched the news with hollow stares. Their tormentors were now heroes. In America, few knew the name Operation Paperclip. And those who did, kept silent. Huntsville, Alabama. The German enclave had taken root. Locals called it Little Bavaria, neatly trimmed homes, wives baking strudel, German heard in every grocery aisle. Children of former SS officers now played baseball under the southern sun. Wernher von Braun was the king of this strange kingdom. He now worked at Redstone Arsenal, a military installation camouflaged as a research base. His team, largely comprised of ex-Nazi engineers, was hard at work developing the Redstone missile, the United States' first large-scale ballistic rocket. Publicly, he was a patriot. Privately, he was still a man of calculation. The Redstone project was a crucial step toward intercontinental delivery systems. But von Braun's ambitions went beyond Earth's orbit. He spoke of space stations, lunar colonies, even Mars missions. His old sketches, some drawn in bunkers as bombs fell over Berlin, resurfaced in glossy NASA pamphlets. No one mentioned where the original designs had been tested, or at what cost. In Washington, classified hearings unfolded behind closed doors. A senator from New York demanded to know why war criminals were now on government payrolls. His staff had uncovered a dossier detailing Arthur Rudolph's role in Mittelwerk, including testimonies from forced labor survivors. The Pentagon responded coldly, "He is indispensable." The hearings were sealed. Meanwhile, in Europe, Mossad agents compiled lists. Names, locations, photos. Paperclip scientists were not just in the US, they had scattered across South America, Canada, even Australia. Not all had escaped clean. Some were assassinated in Buenos Aires. Others vanished without trace. But those in America remained untouched. Protected. By 1955, von Braun had become a naturalized U.S. citizen. The same man who once stood beside Himmler at Peenemünde now pledged allegiance to the Stars and Stripes. In his speeches, he spoke of destiny, of mankind's future among the stars. But within NASA, a different kind of scientist watched from the shadows. Hubertus Strughold, once chief medical scientist of the Luftwaffe, now headed the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine. He pioneered research in zero-G effects on the human body. Time magazine called him a visionary. His past? Inconvenient. Documents showed his involvement in human experimentation at Dachau, frozen limbs, hypobaric chambers, fatal exposure trials. When questioned, Strughold denied everything. The witnesses were dead, the files, inconclusive. He remained on the payroll until 1968. In a windowless room at Fort Detrick, Maryland, a young biologist opened a package marked Top Secret, Project Artichoke. Inside, fragments of Nazi research on mind control, interrogation resistance, and induced psychosis. Translated, annotated, cross-referenced. The biologist read them for hours. Later that night, he vomited in the sink. But the work continued. That file would eventually pass into the hands of Sidney Gottlieb, the mastermind behind MK-Ultra. The ghosts of Paperclip had begun to infect other programs. Not just rockets, but chemicals, drugs, psychological warfare. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. The metal sphere soared overhead in silence, and America panicked. Within weeks, von Braun was thrust into the spotlight. His team was finally given clearance to launch their own satellite. The Explorer I mission was born, and with it, NASA. The American public cheered. Children were told the stars belonged to them. But in secret, the military's interest was more terrestrial. They wanted payloads, not probes. The space race was a cover for weapons in orbit. Von Braun understood this. He'd understood it in 1943. But now, the chessboard was global. In quiet corners of intelligence briefings, a new threat was whispered. The Soviets were using former Nazi scientists too. Paperclip had not been a monopoly, it had been a race. The secrets of the Reich had been divided like spoils. Russia had their own von Brauns, their own Rudolphs, their own ghosts. The world had entered a new phase, not peace, not war, but a cold, calculated twilight. The age of shadows had begun. The skies over Cape Canaveral rumbled as the Redstone rocket thundered upward, carrying Alan Shepard, the first American in space. The crowd cheered, flashbulbs lit the press platform. The president called it a triumph of democracy. But in the VIP stands, behind sunglasses and military escorts, sat the architects of that rocket, men who once saluted Hitler. Von Braun smiled for the cameras. His accent, now softened by years of American life, gave him an air of intellectual charm. Few reporters asked about his past anymore. Fewer still dared to investigate what his former subordinates remembered. One of them, an aging technician, kept a photo hidden in a box at home. A black and white image of corpses stacked outside Mittelwerk, their bodies emaciated, their hands bound. He had taken it in 1945, after the Allies liberated the underground complex. He'd been ordered to forget. By 1961, Project Mercury was gaining momentum. NASA's public image was pure, heroic, and thoroughly American. But internal memos told a different story. One addressed to the President's Science Advisory Committee read, "Recommend a comprehensive review of Paperclip alumni for potential exposure. Civil rights organizations may soon question the ethical basis of our space program." It was never acted upon. In Alabama, African American civil rights groups began to organize protests outside Redstone Arsenal. They didn't know the full extent of the history, but they knew something was wrong. Why were German war criminals treated as heroes while black Americans were barred from voting, from schools, from dignity? The press ignored them. Then came the Eichmann trial. In 1961, Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann, the logistics mastermind behind the Holocaust. His trial, broadcast globally, reignited public interest in the Nazi regime. Survivors told stories of experiments, of horrors, of names. And one name surfaced unexpectedly: Arthur Rudolph. Testimony from a former prisoner described a tall man with a limp, who spoke fluent German, and oversaw punishments at Mittelwerk. The description matched Rudolph exactly. But Rudolph was untouchable. He was now a director on NASA's Saturn V rocket program, working directly under von Braun. The Justice Department was alerted. But the files were marked classified. That same year, Wernher von Braun was awarded the National Medal of Science. At the ceremony, the president praised his vision, his brilliance, and his unwavering dedication to the American dream. A young staffer whispered to a colleague, "Is this the same man who built weapons for Hitler?" The colleague replied, flatly, "He builds them for us now. That's what matters." The Saturn V project was monumental. Towering over 36 stories tall, it was the largest, most powerful rocket ever constructed. The manned missions it would carry were not just scientific milestones, they were ideological weapons, a demonstration of American supremacy. But not everyone on the team was blind to the contradiction. A janitor, himself a veteran of the Normandy landings, walked the corridors of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in silence. Every morning, he passed by offices with German names on the doors. Some of those names matched dog tags he'd seen in the pockets of dead comrades in 1944. He never said a word. But every now and then, he would leave a newspaper clipping on a desk. A photo from Buchenwald, a quote from a survivor. No one ever confronted him. But some began locking their office doors at night. In 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. Millions wept, cheered, believed. Von Braun, watching from mission control, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not for Hitler, not for America, but for the rocket. That was always the true master. And behind him, in silence, stood the ghosts of Mittelwerk. The men who'd died in tunnels. The files that had been burned. The names that had been erased. Operation Paperclip had succeeded. America had won the space race. But at what cost? A quiet suburb outside Los Angeles. Arthur Rudolph sat on his porch, watching the sun melt into the hills. His American dream had unfolded perfectly. A fine house, a U.S. passport, a pension from NASA. He was nearly 80 now, but sharp. The Saturn V had been his masterpiece, his name etched in aerospace history. Then came the knock. Two men in dark suits stood at the door. They weren't journalists or neighbors. They were from the Office of Special Investigations, a little-known branch of the U.S. Department of Justice. And they carried a file, thick, yellowed, and damning. Inside were photos, camp records, witness accounts from Mittelwerk survivors, handwritten orders bearing his signature. One of the agents asked calmly, "Dr. Rudolph, do you deny that slave laborers died under your supervision?" Rudolph stared at them for a moment before answering. "We were at war. Everyone did what they had to." The United States offered him a deal: renounce your citizenship and leave quietly, or face prosecution for war crimes. He chose exile. Weeks later, he boarded a plane to Hamburg. No fanfare, no press, just silence. America had finally severed one of its most controversial ties. But Operation Paperclip was far from over. That same year, the New York Times ran a brief story. Former Nazi scientist deported after Justice Department review. It was buried on page 19. Behind the scenes, a war of documents had begun. Newly declassified CIA records revealed extensive efforts to whitewash Paperclip personnel files. Sworn Nazi affiliations had been erased. SS ranks omitted. Intelligence officers had forged clearance memos to fast-track immigration processes. Even high-ranking officials admitted, off the record, "We may have knowingly brought war criminals into the heart of our defense infrastructure." But there were no trials. No hearings. Only quiet reassignments. In Huntsville, a local historian named Catherine Lewis began collecting oral histories from early NASA engineers. What she uncovered stunned her. Stories of secretive meetings, German staff refusing to speak of the war, old photographs that had been hastily destroyed. One retired technician showed her a file, marked "Burn" after reading. It was a personnel assessment dated 1947. It confirmed that certain scientists had direct knowledge of human experimentation, but were of high value to strategic interests. Lewis tried to publish her findings. Academic journals rejected the manuscript. Unsubstantiated, they claimed. Yet the file sat in her safe, undeniable. In 1990, the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. Soviet archives were opened to the West. Within them were files, mirror images of America's paperclip. The Soviets, too, had absorbed Nazi expertise. Engineers from the Eastern Zone had vanished into secret cities. Some were even tasked with developing biological weapons under Stalin's orders. It was a confirmation of what many feared. The Cold War had been built, in part, on the ashes of the Third Reich. And both sides had played the same game. By the early 2000s, declassified materials trickled into public awareness. Documentaries were made, books published, but the narrative remained diluted, wrapped in patriotic triumphs, moon landings, and Cold War victories. Few wanted to confront the uncomfortable truth. America's greatest scientific achievements were entangled with one of history's greatest evils. Von Braun's name still adorns schools, museums, even streets. But in some corners of Huntsville, the older residents whisper stories their parents told them, about accents in the night, fenced compounds, and strange visitors who never gave their real names. One final file, unearthed in 2010, bore no title. It was a list, typewritten, single-spaced, with 104 names. At the top, a handwritten note. Approved for extraction. Strategic priority. Ethics. TBD. The signature was smudged, but the date was clear, May 1945. The beginning of Operation Paperclip. And perhaps, the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought not with armies, but with silence, secrets, and science born in the dark. Langley, Virginia, 2017. In a soundproof sublevel of CIA headquarters, behind two biometric gates and a rotating cipher lock, sat a room known unofficially as the Black Vault. It held some of the most sensitive documents the agency had ever collected, files never meant to see the light of day. On shelf C4, between Cold War psychological operations and atomic espionage, rested a single gray box marked Operation Paperclip, Ext, Ultra. Inside, yellowing folders, brittle with age. But buried deep in the stack was a document that didn't match the others, clean paper, recent ink, dated 2004. It was a translated interrogation transcript from an ex-KGB colonel, detailing a man known only by codename, Helios. According to the Soviet defector, Helios was a Nazi scientist captured by the Americans in 1945, never officially listed, never processed for paperclip. Yet he had allegedly conducted research at Ahnenerbe facilities in the Alps, connected to Nazi occult experiments, advanced propulsion theories, and mind interface weaponry. The Soviets had tried, and failed, to track him. The document ended with a line typed in bold. We believe Helios was extracted by U.S. agents and relocated under a parallel program, outside the jurisdiction of paperclip. There was no other record of him. In 2019, FOIA activists lobbying for full declassification of Operation Paperclip met fierce resistance. Key files remained redacted, especially those pertaining to early CIA-Nazi collaborations in South America. One document was refused entirely. Its file number, 11966VK. Independent researchers who chased the lead ended up in a web of vanished scientists, false identities, and bizarre technical drawings, one showing a circular craft, annotated in German, with equations not seen in any known physics textbook. At the bottom of the page, a signature, Dr. Victor Clay. There was no record of Clay anywhere. No birth certificate, no university history, nothing in U.S. or Nazi archives. But there were references, in Cold War radio intercepts, in obscure U.S. Army memos, in UFO researcher files. Someone had erased him from history. Back at Langley, the box containing the Helios transcript was quietly moved, no digital record of its new location. When asked, the agency's archivist simply responded, "That collection no longer exists." St. Louis, Missouri, 2021. In a weather-beaten warehouse outside the city, a private collector known only as the Archivist stored one of the largest uncatalogued collections of World War II documents in the country. No formal degrees, no institutional ties. Just a reputation, built in the shadows, for uncovering what others buried. Former intelligence agents, disillusioned academics, and even conspiracy theorists sent him artifacts. Letters, microfilm, stolen reels from destroyed archives. One package arrived without a return address, a steel canister labeled VK 11966. Inside, scorched papers, a cracked slide reel, and a single photograph. The photo was faded but intact. It showed a group of men in military uniforms standing beside an unusual craft, disc-shaped, metallic, matte black, roughly 20 feet in diameter. At the center stood a figure whose face was partially obscured. But the resemblance was uncanny. The man in the photo matched early ID photos of Wernher von Braun. Yet the photo was dated 1943, and the background wasn't Peenemünde. It was somewhere deep in the Austrian Alps. Stamped on the back, Clay Facility, Opengruppen, 7,500 feet, Top Secret, SSRF. The Archivist cross-referenced it with Allied reconnaissance maps from 1945. No such facility was listed. But in the Opengruppen range, beneath glacial layers, geologists had recorded unnatural magnetic readings in the 1970s, never explained. Diving further, he found fragments of a 1946 British intelligence report describing anti-gravity research under Himmler's direct supervision, supposedly connected to Ahnenerb's esoteric science wing. The report mentioned only 2 living witnesses, both dead within a year of the report's writing. One by stroke, the other by apparent suicide. Both before testifying. And the name that appeared in their notes, again and again, was Dr. Victor Clay. Public records still showed no trace of Clay. But a decades-old flight manifest from 1945, recently declassified, showed a civilian engineer boarded a plane from Bavaria to Wright Field, Ohio under an alias, Victor Klein. The destination? A black site adjacent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, now rumored to have housed not only paperclip scientists, but recovered foreign technology. Most of the base's 1950s records had been destroyed in a fire. Officially, the cause was never determined. By 2022, the Archivist published an encrypted dossier online, accessible only by key. Inside were high-res scans of the VK 11966 contents, with annotations suggesting a split within Operation Paperclip, an off-books program that extracted not just engineers, but those working on non-conventional science. He called it Project Selenite. Days after the upload, his account went silent. The warehouse was found empty. Hard drives gone, papers shredded, surveillance footage erased. His last online message, posted hours before disappearance, was a single line. Helios was not a person. It was a payload. Nevada Test Range, 1974. Beneath the desert, far below where mushroom clouds once bloomed, lay Site 24, an underground facility buried deeper than any missile silo. Its official designation was Research and Containment, Atmospheric Systems, but those who worked there called it something else. The Pit. No public map marked its location. No above-ground structure hinted at the miles of corridors and vaults spiraling below. The men and women who entered the pit did so under lifetime NDAs. And among them, only a handful had ever seen Room Helios. It was not a lab. It was a vault. And inside it rested something never replicated, never explained. A black, disc-like object, 11 meters wide, cold to the touch, immune to corrosion. Its surface bore etchings, geometric patterns, some resembling Norse runes, others pure mathematics. No nation on Earth claimed it. The only document tied to its existence was a memo from 1945, signed by a U.S. Army major under the Paperclip command chain. Object recovered. Matched parameters described by Clay. Contains composite materials unknown to Allied science. Maintain indefinite containment under Project Selenite. Disclosed to no foreign agency. No other documents mentioned Victor Clay again. In 1991, During a routine audit of classified assets post-Cold War, a young Pentagon analyst uncovered a discrepancy: a $16 million annual budget allocated to a special propulsion recovery program, with no listed personnel, no reported outcomes. The analyst submitted a formal request for clarity. 1 week later, he was reassigned to an unrelated Arctic radar station. Months later, he resigned from government entirely. Years later, he'd speak at a closed symposium. No cameras, no press. His final words that day: "There's a reason von Braun was never afraid of the Soviets. The real payload wasn't a rocket. It was a door." Somewhere in Utah, a private aerospace contractor, working under DARPA funding, conducted high-altitude tests of propulsion systems modeled loosely on declassified Nazi-era schematics. One prototype, designated VK9, achieved a maneuver previously deemed aerodynamically impossible: an instantaneous angular shift with no inertial drag. The onboard telemetry froze during the event. When the craft was recovered, the internal AI navigation system had recorded a brief, inexplicable electromagnetic spike, one that exactly matched a 1974 signature logged inside room Helios. DARPA engineers flagged the anomaly. But the lead investigator on the project, a civilian physicist, was found dead days later. Official cause: heart failure. He was 36. Theories abound. That Operation Paperclip was never just about rockets. That Project Selenite was never just about secrets. That Helios wasn't merely a code name, but an activation protocol, connected to something buried, something built long before Peenemünde, long before the Reich. A technology the Nazis uncovered, but could not explain. Something they feared, even as they tried to master it. And that the Americans didn't just inherit the science. They inherited the lock. Epilogue: there are still places within NASA, DARPA, and the U.S. Air Force where the names von Braun, Rudolph, and Strughold are spoken with quiet reverence. Not for who they were, but for what they left behind. And in a desert vault, still buried beneath layers of concrete and code, sits the payload called Helios. Not powered. Not opened. Not yet. But always watching.